Hello, Tubby and Coos fans. It's me, Candace, again, bringing another author event to you. I am really excited. This is the first author event that we're able to do since the flood. So this event is actually rescheduled because that was supposed to be like the day after the flood happened. So I'm really excited that we were still able to have this event. Today, I'm talking with David Mack, who is the author of the Dark Art series. The first book in that series was called The Midnight Front, followed by The Iron Codex, and the final book is called The Shadow Commission, and that was just released in August. So the trilogy is now finished. I know I have a lot of binge readers out there, so you can read the whole thing. David is the award-winning and New York Times best-selling author of more than 36 novels, so he's super prolific, and he's written a lot of short works of science fiction, fantasy, and adventure as well, including the Star Trek Destiny and Cold Equations trilogies. David's writing credits span television. He wrote a couple of episodes of Deep Space Nine, Star Trek. I know some of you will be interested in that. He's written for film. He's written comic books. His upcoming projects include include some short stories in two crowdfunded anthologies and also a new Star Trek novel, which we're going to talk about. He actually had a Star Trek novel come out on the same day as the Shadow Commission. And he currently works as a consultant on two of the Star Trek animated television series, Star Trek Lower Decks and Star Trek Prodigy, which I don't think is aired yet, but will soon. So welcome, David. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me on. It's great to be here.
So tell us a little bit about yourself, I guess, first off. Something that wasn't in that bio, but just something interesting.
Something not in the bio, but interesting. Well, I'm kind of a wine nerd. Came to it because because I'm a drunk, but also because I used to work in restaurants a lot when I was young. I spent maybe 6 years from high school through college. Always sort of paying my bills and getting, little spending money. I worked in kitchens. I did just about everything you could think of. I was a bartender, an ice cream scoop guy. I made pizza, flipped burgers, you name it. I probably did it in the restaurant industry. And then I ended up working for a while for a restaurant news publication back in the 90s. And as part of that job, I got to learn a lot about fine dining, restaurant design, but I especially got opportunities to learn about wine. So I got very interested in wine. And now these days, with a group of friends here in the New York City area, I make wine. We have been making wine now for about a decade. We make a batch per year. We sometimes source our grapes from California. Sometimes we get them from other places. We're actually looking into getting some pre-made juice from Italy for our next batch. And we're looking into South American wines maybe for the spring. But my role in the group is that I'm the designer of the labels. I make labels for our custom wines. And they're usually names are bad puns, and then I find an art to bring the bad pun to life. But, as a result, I've become kind of a wine nerd. I know a little bit about pairing wine with food, what goes with what. And I know now, I know just enough to be dangerous about making wine. And it's kind of fun.
Yeah, that's really cool that you make wine. I used to be a huge wine drinker back in the day. We made several trips to wine country in California, and that was really cool. But I think it's super cool that you actually make your own wine. That's awesome. So let's talk about the Dark Art series, which is the biggest thing we're here to talk about today. Can you tell us a little bit more? So just to let viewers know, if you haven't read this series, it's a secret history fantasy. And the series follows the two main characters are Cade Martin and Anya, right? Kernova. And
Yep.
They have these adventures. And the first book is like a war epic in the 1930s and 40s. The second book is set in, I think, 1945. And it
54.
54, sorry. I transposed those. And it's like a spy thriller with the Cold War and espionage. And then this new book is like a conspiracy thriller set right after the assassination of JFK. So that's like a very brief synopsis of the three books. So tell us a little bit about the series as a whole, a little bit more, and like what inspired you to write this?
Well, the idea of it came to me as I was working on sort of a cyberpunk plus black magic thing, and I kept getting drawn to the backstory of the villain, which I kept thinking would be set in World War II. And eventually I realized that was the story that I really wanted to tell. So I embarked on this idea of a series that would take place in different periods of history, starting in World War II. And then the idea was to jump roughly a decade or so with each book, so that we would have these characters who, because they had made Faustian bargains, would age very slowly. They would get into adventures throughout the decades, and we would hop through. And originally, I thought maybe this could be an ongoing series. We follow them into the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. But then eventually it became clear we were working on a trilogy. So I decided just to do a story about sort of that middle America period of World War II through the death of JFK, because that really sort of marks the loss of innocence for the country in a very big way, the shock to the system. And the idea was to have a secret history, so that instead of making it alt history and changing events, I'm looking at secret things that happen behind the scenes of real history. And then for the magic system, what I settled upon for that was I took Renaissance era black magic, the notion of ceremonial black magic as depicted in certain books like the Clavicula Salomonis Regis, also known as the Lesser Key of Solomon or the Lemegeton, or books like Pseudomonarchia Demonium, A.E. Waite's Book of Black Magic and of Pax. And I took these very real magical ceremonies, and I moved forward with the assumption, what if they worked exactly the way they said they did? Then, with a little help from a friend of mine named Aaron Rosenberg, who is a veteran author of science fiction, fantasy, middle grade books, but also a variety of role-playing games, we adjusted the magic system to make it a little more cinematic. With his help, I invented this thing called yoking, where the magician summons a demon and then forcibly, magically binds the demon to their own flesh. And for as long as they can hold the demon in thrall to their will, they can wield the demon's signature powers as if those powers were their own. But this power comes with consequences. If you do this, you usually wind up afflicted with nightmares, stomach disruptions, you have obsessive compulsive disorder, self-harm behavior starts to set in after a while. And the more demons you hold, and the longer you hold them, the worse it gets. So battle mages who hold lots of demons for a long period of time tend to be alcoholics or drug addicts, because they're always trying to deaden the chorus of evil voices in their head. And what I eventually realized while working on the first book, and I talked this over with its acquiring editor, Marco Palmieri, was I realized in a lot of ways the magic system that I had devised was an allegory for my creative process and the role that substances, let's say, play in the creative process of the artist grappling with the demons and then doing whatever's necessary to harness and control the demons to get the desired results. So that was sort of where that came from. And the inspiration for that was a 1968 novel by James Blish called Black Easter. And it's a very different kind of book than anything I've done here. He was writing a more scholarly book, a more intellectual book about the philosophy behind black magic. And I wanted to do something much more action-oriented. But he had this whole postulate of what if the old grimoires work exactly like they said they do. And it's a chilling, frightening, terrifying book whose last line haunted me. I read it as a teenager, and it haunted me pretty much ever since. And as a result, 30 years later, after reading it, I came around to writing the Dark Arts series because of Black Easter.
That is really cool. And I was actually going to ask about your magic system because it's really interesting. So I'm glad that you went into that because I thought it was cool. And one thing that you didn't mention, just so that readers know, is that the system works under the premise like you have to summon something, a demon or an angel, to do any kind of like real magic. So anything that's not like stage magic. If you want to do actual magic, you have to conjure and control a demon or an angel. And there's this hierarchy as well. So if you're a master magician, you can like strike a deal with like a head demon essentially, and then you get to use anyone subordinate to it. So there's this whole like hierarchy and sort of politics that go into your magic system that I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, I got some of that from Blish, but also some of it just from reading the old grimoires and from reading accounts of how the demons deal with each other in hell. And then some of it was just my own invention. But you have this notion of the descending hierarchy, is how they refer to the hierarchy of power in hell. You have the emperor, Satan Mechatrig, and the idea is Satan can never be summoned, and the two lieutenants who I guess are directly beneath him, I believe one is Beelzebub, maybe it's Baphomet, and I can't remember the other one. It's on. I have the chart somewhere. These three can never be summoned. But beneath the lower two, each of them, those two in turn, each control 3 ministers of hell. And these 3 ministers vary in degrees of power. You have Lucifuge Rofakal, who is the prime minister of hell, most powerful of the bunch, most dangerous of the bunch, most likely to enslave you if you choose him or it as your patron. And then the others, Paimon is powerful but less dangerous than Lucifuge, and so on down the line, Asmodeus, Astaroth. So it depends on how much power you want and how much power you think you can control and how powerful a patron you think you're ready to deal with. And the idea was you had to pick one of the 6 as your patron, and you can only have one. Now, each of these patrons can control multiple magicians, but a magician can have only one patron. Once you choose your patron, you get access to all the spirits that are subordinate to them. So the advantage of choosing the more powerful patron, riskier though it is you get a broader array of talents possibly open to you, but more risk comes with it. And in the book, both angels and demons are referred to as presences with a capital P. There's a lot of strange capitalization in Renaissance era black magic, presences. And my favorite thing, the thing that always intrigued me since I read the Blish book, was the term that describes the profession of the sorcerer who controls the demons. It's called Karcist. Apparently, this is the highest level of adept in the training of black magic, and then there's a master Karcist or master magician. It's spelled with a K, Karcist. I always just thought this was the coolest word, Karcist. I'd never heard it before. I'd never seen it in any other context, but I realized that Blish got it from A.E. Waite's Book of Black Magic and of Pacts. And it's public domain. It's been out there since like the 19th century. So I realized just how cool a system this was. It lends itself to role-playing games. If there are any role-playing game companies out there that would like to, license this, I've done all the work. Please contact my agent.
Yes, please do, because this would be an amazing role-playing game based on this series, and just purely based on your magic system. There could be a super cool RPG, even with nothing else, because I just thought it was so cool. And like you, I hadn't really seen some of this stuff before either, like Karcist. I hadn't seen that anywhere. So it was super interesting to me, just the way that it all sort of works. I thought, it was unique in how your magic system sort of just worked. And the angels also are in there, and they're a little bit more difficult than the demons, because you have to have permission from God. Has to send allow the angel, right? To
you can make supplicate. Yeah, you can supplicate the angels, but they're under no obligation to obey you. Demons, having been cut off from the divine, have to obey humans. And what you find out, I think, in the second book of the series is that part of the reason that demons find themselves bound to obey human Karcists is that we are all imbued with a spark of the divine. The human soul is essentially a spark cast off of the Empyrean flame of God. And so that puts us higher in the hierarchy because the demons have been cut off from God. So that puts us above them in hierarchy and allows us to command. The angels are still connected, at least through a demiurge, to the imperial flame, or the Empyrean flame, as it's called. And as a result, they don't have to obey. If it serves the whims of heaven, maybe they grant a supplication, but you cannot command them.
Yeah, and I thought that was really cool. Just the way, because it just makes sense. It's like, oh yeah, if this was a thing, this is totally how it would work. Like, it's just so believable.
Thank you. It's very cool.
And so tell us a little bit about your research process, because all three of these books take place during different times in history. And like you said, there are these secret histories sort of behind the real history. So tell us a little bit about the research that you did for the series.
The research was extensive, starting with the magic system, having to go and read cover to cover all of the Book of Black Magic and of Pax, reading all of the Lesser Key of Solomon, reading the rituals, reading about the demons. As much as possible, I tried to make certain that the powers ascribed to the demons in my books match those that were ascribed to them, let's say, in the Lesser Key. Sometimes I had to take poetic license. If I needed a power and a demon had to be ascribed to it, well, then sometimes I just made a judgment call. But history was where the real research happened, especially the first book, The Midnight Front, because it takes place during World War II. And it involves real historical battles because it involves the Holocaust. My research had to be impeccable. So I was finding lots of firsthand sources, firsthand accounts, survivor accounts from the Holocaust. For instance, there's a sequence in the first book that takes place in Kiev at Babi Yar, which is essentially a ravine near Kiev in Ukraine, where the Nazis, one of their Einsatzgruppen units, executed thousands of Jews at Babi Yar ravine. And for the depiction of that scene, it's one of the most horrific, terrifying scenes in the book. I made sure I found the account of a survivor, someone who was there, who wound up in the ravine but somehow didn't die and got out and told their story. A lot of the details of that scene, of the lines in the streets that lead to the entrance to the woods, the approach to the ravine, being terrorized by the dogs, the way all the possessions were stripped away. And then, like, even the detail, there's like a moment when a Nazi guard basically pulls an infant out of the mother's arms and flings it into the air over the ravine. And the Nazis are taking pot shots at the baby while it's falling. It's a horrific detail. And my editor originally said, this might be a bit too far. Maybe we could scale this back. And I said, I'm not going to scale that back because that's a witness account. The Nazis did that, and I'm not going to whitewash the evil of what they did. There were some scenes where I had concocted stuff, and I said, those I will pare back in the interest of, minimizing the depiction of harm to minors, harm to children, whatever. We won't do it gratuitously, but where it represents real crimes that were committed, those I'm going to stick to my guns on. And fortunately, he agreed with me on that. But like the level of detail that I did on this for, let's say, the landings at Omaha Beach or Pont de Hoc in this case, I knew, for instance, the landing boats that they used, the Higgins boats, also known as LCAs, which were built in New Orleans, by the way.
Cool.
That's also a reason I came to New Orleans at one point, was because New Orleans is the home of the National World War II Museum, which was an invaluable resource. And I came there and I did firsthand research at the World War II Museum down in the French Quarter in New Orleans. I knew the numbers of every boat that landed. I knew the names of the real lieutenants who commanded the boats. I knew which ships they deployed from, the minutes that they hit the beach. I found the actual floor plans, like the actual Nazi floor plans for the bunkers that they built on Pont de Hoc, because they were built out of a template so that they would always be the same wherever they built their gun emplacements. I found the original plan, so I knew down to the centimeter every chamber of the gun emplacement. I could tell you everything about it. And I did that for every little thing, like the fact that the French resistance was using the catacombs under Paris, the way operations were being run out of Gibraltar, every little thing about the SOE, Special Operations Executive. I got every little detail about the Island Donan Castle up in Scotland, where much of the first book, the first act, takes place. I got the actual floor plans for the castle, as well as tons of interior photography. So that level of research carried through on the second book, where I was researching things like Bikini Atoll, where the United States did nuclear testing in the early 50s. The Marshall Islands are where we detonated the Castle Bravo nuclear device, which is the single largest thermonuclear device ever test detonated by the U.S. And so I researched like the heck out of that facility, and every little thing about the detonation chamber, and it's a level of research that I think the readers demand, especially people who enjoy historical fiction. They're going to appreciate the fact that I've gone to the effort to ground the stories in reality as firmly as possible, because I feel like if you can trust that the author has done the homework, knows the period, knows the history, knows the locations, the clothes, the music, the food, everything, grounded in that reality, then the story carries this weight. You can feel that the characters are grounded in that sense of time and place. So the third book, which involves the assassination of JFK, I was fortunate that one of my beta readers happens to be kind of a JFK nerd in much the way that I'm a wine nerd. And he was able to fact check me on the assassination sequence. When we're depicting the assassination of JFK, he apparently just happens to have at home a digital file of the Zapruder film.
Oh, wow.
And he checked it frame by frame, and he was giving me notes in the sequence where Kennedy is shot early in the book. He was going at 1/18th of a second intervals, frame by frame, noting the action and saying, actually, this guy wouldn't have been here yet. By this point, he wouldn't be touching the bumper yet. This is where his head went back. So he noted it, and we actually got the timing down to an accuracy of 1/18th of a second.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's
He did not mess around. This guy knew what he was talking about.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, of course, I usually just like trust, like you're saying, that like authors did their research and know, and it seemed like it was real, but I didn't realize it was that accurate. Like, that's really cool.
Yeah, I wanted to make sure, because I knew that the only people that are bigger buffs than World War II buffs are Kennedy assassination buffs. If you get your facts wrong on a Kennedy assassination sequence, they will flay you forever.
That is true. That's very true. So tell us a bit more about the Shadow Commission specifically. I know that there are some people watching who are excited for it, who have read the other books. So for people who have read the series, but without like spoiling too much.
Without giving it away,
tell us a bit more and how it connects to everything else.
Okay. If the first book covers 6 years of World War II, the second book covers 60 days at the beginning of 1954, and that's a Cold War spy thriller. Book 3 covers roughly 7 days, starting with the assassination of Kennedy and covering about a week of time after that. And the premise behind it is sort of 3 days of the Condor, but hunting magicians instead of spies. And our heroes, at this point, we've caught up with them. We're about 9 years past the previous book. They've settled on an island out in like the Greek Isles. They're keeping to themselves. They're trying to stay off the radar. Kate and Anya have married at this point. So they're husband and wife. They're training new young magicians. They're trying to basically build a team of people that they can trust. But they know that if the powers of the world ever found out that they were building this little army of magicians, that someday someone will come for them. They don't know who, they don't know when, but they know it's coming. So they've been preparing for it. And the book kicks off with that long anticipated betrayal kicks into motion, and they realize the day has come. Somebody is coming for us. And it gets bloody real fast. And what ends up happening is they realize that there is a secret cabal known as the Shadow Commission, which has set these events in motion. And unless they can identify who and what the Shadow Commission is and figure out where they are, they're not going to be able to fight back. So the first part of the book is our heroes sort of constantly being pushed back, just trying to survive, trying to get one step ahead. And then the second part of the book is them finding a tactical opportunity to take the fight to the enemy, They think that they've got the upper hand, but as so often happens, these things go awry. And it's basically, the whole thing is a story about betrayal. It's about countries, being betrayed by their leaders. It's about people being betrayed by their underlings. It's about feeling like you've betrayed those who trusted you because you failed them. It's about betraying yourself. But at the end of it, it's also about heroes who step up, because there wouldn't be any point to a story about betrayal if there wasn't somebody at the heart of it who represented the other side of the coin, which is faultless loyalty, loyalty unto the bitter end. So it's basically about loyalty, but also about betrayal. And it's, as people have come to expect by this point in my career, they know it's going to be a bloodbath.
That's true. It is always a bloodbath.
Pretty much. There's a reason Star Trek readers call me the Angel of Death.
That's fair. That's a fair title, I think. So tell us a little bit more about the Shadow Commission specifically, this secret cabal, because I think it's really interesting. Where did you get that idea from? How did you craft that? And I had
the title before I knew what it was.
Okay.
The titles for the entire series came out of, the first one, The Midnight Front, is a play on the concept of the Western Front or the Eastern Front. Iron Codex is a play on the Iron Curtain. And the Shadow Commission, because it takes place at the time of the Kennedy assassination, is a play on the Warren Commission. So that was the idea, is that these secret history novels had these titles that were going to be allusions to the periods of history that they take place in, or something that was prominent, or considered fairly prominent at that time. So I had this title, but I didn't know what the Shadow Commission was. As it became clearer that the third book was going to be pretty much the end for the series, I realized, all right, I need something big. I need something relatively final and climactic. And I hit upon the notion of the Shadow Commission being an allegory for late-stage terminal capitalism, starting with the robber barons of the late 19th century, the kind of people who got us into the first stock market crash in 1929, but also just the sort of people, the power brokers, the puppet masters, people like how Moriarty is depicted in some of the recent Robert Downey Sherlock Holmes films, where he's manipulating the world into, or at least Europe, into war and planning to profit off of both sides. That's these people. And I decided to make them an international cabal. I thought that given their origins, probably in the 19th century, it would make sense for them to be men, probably villains. They're going to have sexist attitudes. They're going to have chauvinistic attitudes. They're going to be proto-fascist. And so I had the idea of these people as sort of the tycoons. And these were basically people who were billionaires before anybody knew what a billionaire was. These were people who learned how to launder money before the rest of the world had reason to figure out how to launder money. And they've learned how to hide their identities, because part of what they're doing is that they've each got their ring of magicians around them. Each of these tycoons, these secret tycoons in the cabal, each one is protected by a team of 6 magicians. The reason they each have 6 is that each one of those 6 magicians answers to a different minister of hell, so that they can put 6 different sigils on each of these old men to protect them, essentially, from magic. Once they bear the sigil of protection of each of the 6 ministers from hell, no black magician can touch them. And white magicians don't practice attack magic. They don't practice offensive techniques. So they really don't think they have anything to fear from the other side. So one of the benefits these guys gain, they've got their little cabals of magicians who work for them. They also get longer life through various magical techniques. One of them is known as the phylactery. Harry Potter fans might know the concept as a Horcrux. So these guys each have a Horcrux. They've been around for a very long time. They're going to continue to be around for a very long time. They manipulate events from behind the shadows. They're tied into politics, industry, banking, media. And of course, I had to, at the end of the book, I had to include a scene at Bohemian Grove, because it felt to me like that's exactly the kind of place these folks would hang out every July. For folks who don't know what Bohemian Grove is, it also has its roots back in the late 19th century. It's in the Russian River Valley area of California. And it's a gathering all men, every year for about 2 weeks in July. The most powerful, mostly right-wing men in the world, mostly from politics, but also from business, banking, entertainment, etc. They gather at Bohemian Grove. They have a quasi-black magic ritual called the Cremation of Care, where they have Care as the sort of embalmed or mummified body, and it is set ablaze, and it is meant to represent the release of all sort of worldly concerns, like stop worrying about your life for 2 weeks, you're at Bohemian Grove. But it also looks a lot like a sacrifice to Moloch. And their owl-shaped statue looks a lot like a representation of the demon Moloch. In reality, Bohemian Grove is really just a bunch of spoiled men peeing on redwood trees in the forest, getting drunk and telling dumb stories, and basically making alliances. In the book, it's something far more sinister, and Bohemian Grove is protected by black magic, etc. But that was the idea, was to basically set up as the villain not just these 5 individuals within the commission, but to say that the actual overarching villain that afflicts us all is greed, late-stage capitalism, patriarchy, all of it sort of rolled into one, and white supremacy, all of it rolled into one toxic mix. And that this is essentially a representation of that toxic force.
Cool. And it does seem like a real thing. I mean, even though it's not, like you said, like it's like, man, I could imagine just these like billionaire people being like,
they're all too plausible.
doing these rituals. And yeah, it is. They're all looking for, I don't know. It's kind of like that photo from back in the day where the orb photo. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Kind of
Trump and the Saudis, and they're all around the glowing orb.
All around that globe.
And you expect Saruman to come out of it.
Power from that.
One ring to in the darkness bind them. Yeah, it's like...
Exactly. So I did want to talk about Star Trek a little bit as well, to kind of pivot, because you've had a long career with Star Trek, and you actually had a novel that came out on the same day as the Shadow Commission, More Beautiful Than Death. So can you tell us a little bit about that novel also?
Yeah, that's a fun story. It was a book that was commissioned over a decade ago, shortly after the first of the J.J. Abrams films came out. And I was told by the publisher they wanted a book that would be based on the new movie, that particular incarnation of the characters, that vision of the Star Trek universe. So I sat down to craft something that would be unique to that particular incarnation of Trek. But then there were some disagreements behind the scenes of a political and business nature. Essentially, someone got their wires crossed. Even though technically by the contract, Simon & Schuster had every right to commission and publish the books, there was a larger marketing strategy that had to be taken into consideration. And it was the fact that the movie guys were like, look, we've only got 2 hours of canon established about this version of Trek. Even we don't know where we want to go next with it. And we'd like to have we would like to not have any of our creative options taken off the table by tie-ins. And at the same time, we don't want to, have the tie-ins go one way, we go another way in the movies, and then it looks like none of us are talking to each other. Can you just hold off on them for a while? And so a gentleman's agreement was reached. Simon & Schuster shelved the books. Fortunately, all of us who wrote them, there were 4 of them at the time, all 4 of us got paid in full. It was a rare case in the entertainment industry of the writer not getting screwed. And sadly, they put the books on the shelf. And at that time, I thought, well, we'll never see those again. The next movies will come out. They'll contradict various details that we had in our manuscripts. They'll be unsalvageable, yada, yada, yada. What actually ended up happening was that 2 of the 4 books got repurposed by their authors, I believe, into either other Star Trek novels or into original work. That left only 2, mine and the book by Alan Dean Foster. And as it turned out, after the 3rd movie, Star Trek Beyond, they actually hadn't contradicted many of the details in either of our books. And a couple of years went by and they realized, there doesn't seem to be any new movie product happening in the pipeline, at least not imminently. we still have these books. We would like them to get out into the world. So the publisher contacted me last fall and said, we're going to release that book in the summer of 2020. We'd like you to do a pass-through, a polishing draft, get it cleaned up, ready for prime time. I said, sure. And it turned out I really only had to make one change because of one line of dialogue in Star Trek Into Darkness. Originally, some of the red shirts in my story were going to be killed, but this story takes place just a few months after the first feature film. And in Into Darkness, Kirk says very clearly, after 2 or 3 years, whatever I've been in command, I haven't lost a single person under my command. Nobody's been killed under my command. I'm like, oh, you had to state it as an absolute, didn't you? You just had to go there. You haven't lost a single person. Thanks a lot. But then it was actually pretty easy. So I revised it. I made the threat in the book lethal to the aliens of the week and merely dangerous or harmful to our people. So I didn't kill any of Kirk's people, but I was still free to kill some of the aliens. And that keeps the threat level up. And so in any event, it's basically a fun little story about challenging our belief in a rational universe. Kirk and his team are sent on what looks like first like a simple economic parlay, bring Ambassador Sarek to the planet, negotiate the lithium rights, yada, yada, yada. And then it all goes wrong because apparently the planet is being overrun by demons. At least this is what the planet's leader is telling us, leading Bones to remark, they don't need a starship crew, they need an exorcist. But it turns out, of course, there's always a scientific explanation. They're not demons, they are creatures from another parallel plane of existence, maybe anti-plane or something. Yada, yada, yada. We get involved. Kirk has to do a bunch of heroic stuff. Spock's got to do some heroic stuff. And then there's a subplot that ties into some very specific details of the new cinematic universe, dealing with Sarek's aide, a woman named Linnell. And she has a storyline that goes back to the destruction of Vulcan in the feature film. And has also got some interesting connections to the original series. But it's a story that could not simply be translated into, say, the original series. Like, when they had to shelve this book, they couldn't just put Shatner's face and Nimoy's face on the cover and put it out like a regular Trek book, because the story is so specific to that cinematic universe that you couldn't just file the serial numbers off. It's that or nothing. It can't be ported to something else. So that's more beautiful than death.
Super interesting. And I'm glad that you said, because I was wondering, because it was essentially a decade, how many changes you had to make, because I was like, man, that must have been rough, but clearly it wasn't. So
not many.
That worked out.
I mean, I did a polishing draft because I like to think that after a decade of work, I have learned a few things.
Sure.
And one of the things that I became aware of, it was not an issue at the time the book was first written, but is an issue now, is that more Star Trek books that are published now have audiobook versions. Back then, they weren't doing audiobooks, at least not on any regular basis. I have found over the last few years, as more of my work has been adapted for audiobooks, that certain stylistic conventions I took for granted writing prose, when you record the book for audio, they sound a bit clunky. The use of he said, she said as dialogue markers, I've always been taught in prose, those are invisible. And to a normal reader reading the prose off the page, they are. But when you're listening to an audiobook version, if you've got an audiobook reader who's putting any effort into doing the voices or the accents, he said and she said actually start to sound a little awkward when you're listening to it. So what I've gotten into the habit of doing is taking out he said, she said, taking out dialogue markers as much as possible, keeping them only when it's absolutely necessary for clarity, and instead using character-related action sentences as tags to dialogue. I find that it flows a little better, and it works better for readers who are narrating the audiobooks. So I rewrote much of More Beautiful Than Death, not to change the content, but to change the style so that it would lend itself more easily to an audiobook narration.
Yes, that is interesting because you're right. In listening to audiobooks, when there's a lot of he said, she said, it takes you out of that conversation when you're listening to it. And so that's totally true. Whereas if it's just a dialogue and then they do something, it doesn't take you out because they're still. So that makes total sense to me.
Yeah, because it feels more like somebody just telling you a story.
Right, exactly. So a question about, so you write for Star Trek, you write a bunch of your own stuff. Is it more difficult, less difficult, the same to write for something that already exists, like a canon, like Star Trek, versus making stuff up completely on your own? How different is it to write for an existing canon versus just what you making stuff up?
They're both difficult, but in different ways. The difficulty in writing for an established universe like Star Trek or Star Wars or 24, Farscape, any of them, is you have to know the continuity, you have to know the characters, the series tone, and you have to be able to put yourself in a mindset where you are channeling that, where you have to say the tone of this is such and such. For instance, with More Beautiful Than Death, to make sure that I was capturing the tone of the movie, I was listening to the soundtrack from the movie. And I specifically did not let myself listen to any music from the original series. I wanted the sound and the tempo of the new movie to be in my head so that when I was crafting action sequences and choreographing things in my mind, I would be thinking in terms of the flow and the pacing and the tempo of the movie, not the TV show. And so with Star Trek, you have to know, like, it helps to know lots of like little picayune details. And it helps that I've grown up with it. I've been watching Star Trek literally my entire life. Grew up watching it in syndicated reruns as a child. I imprinted on it the way a duckling imprints on the first moving thing it sees. So I've got 50 years of living mentally in the Star Trek universe in my head. For me, it's a very natural thing to just be able to mentally exist in the space of Star Trek and tell those stories. For someone who doesn't have that background or that experience, maybe it's a little more difficult. Writing in my own universe, the difficulty was in having enough research, taking enough time to think it out, immerse myself in the people, the places, that it became real. And that's exceptionally difficult. It's a whole different skill set. That was what I learned the hard way writing the Dark Arts series, was that many of the skills I took for granted writing tie-ins, not all of them transfer over. Some new skills had to be learned. By the same token, there are some authors who are excellent at writing original fiction who, the first time they're brought in to write tie-ins, they have to go through a learning curve as they learn that there's a different skill set that they need to learn to apply in order to write in somebody else's voice, capture someone else's characters. But I found that the experience I had of writing for all these different characters, like Kirk or Spock or Jack Bauer or Scorpius, etc., it allowed me to sit back and say, okay, how am I going to differentiate the voices of the different characters in my saga? What are their speech patterns? What are they like? I'm like, okay, Cade is a smart aleck. He's a sarcastic son of a bitch. He's a cynic. He's a pessimist. Anya doesn't say much at all. She won't say 5 words if she can say 4. She tends to be very direct. She tends to be very violent. As I once explained to Natasha Sudek, the woman who read the audiobook narration of book 2, originally she had done an audition reading where she had kind of put like a little bit of a flirty or a sexy spin on some of the line readings for Anya. And the note I sent back was, Anya does not have a sexy or seductive bone in her body. She is a stone-cold knife killer trained in the rubble of Stalingrad. She will not stroke your arm lovingly. She will put a knife in your ribs. This is Anya. And at that point, she did a second reading and she nailed it. It's like once she knew, oh, okay, this isn't Natasha from Boris, Rocky and Bullwinkle. This woman's a killer. It's like, all right. So I had that. I was like, okay, Stefan in book 1, he's a scholar. He's going to speak in poetic turns of phrase. Adair McRae, Scottish vulgarian. He's going to have, Scottish stuff and foul language pretty much spewing from him at all times. And so on down, everybody had their little patterns. Kine is, Kine Engel, who's the villain in book 1. He's lofty. He's got pretensions. He's always quoting literature. He's quoting Milton. He's quoting Shakespeare. He thinks he's a genius. He loves to be arch and threatening. He wants you to fear his intellect. So he's always projecting. And so it was little things like that. Once I realized this is how you find the key into the character. The way they talk is going to tell you who they want the world to think they are.
That is very true. That I think this generally the way people talk is like how they want people to view them. So I think that's super cool. And I know we don't have much time, but I do want you to talk whatever you can tell us. You're doing consulting on the new animated Star Trek shows. Mm-hmm. So what can you tell us about your role in that?
It is a blast. It is a lot of fun to sort of be back in the mix on the TV side, even in just a small way, offering advice as a consultant. The way I described the role of the consultant, or what I saw as my role as a consultant when I was first being interviewed by the Hageman brothers, who are running Star Trek Prodigy, was I said, I am here to be your Star Trek Sherpa. You have a summit you want to reach, a creative mountain you want to climb. And I happen to know a lot about this mountain, this Star Trek mountain you want to scale. I know where the dead ends are. I know where the dangerous crevasses are. My job is to help you carry your burden. I'm here to make your burden easier, to know all the weird, picky and little detail stuff so that you don't have to think about it. I'm here to know where the dead ends are so you don't lose time or money going in unproductive directions. My job is to help you get to the summit you want to reach, help you find the best, trekkiest way to get there, and then when the photographer sets up to take your glorious photo, my job is to step quietly out of frame. And they were like, we like the sound of that, but you don't have to step out of frame. I'm like, no, trust me, when the time comes, you will want me to step out of frame. But working with them, they have been the absolute greatest guys. And then after I was hired on to work for Prodigy, I was also hired on to consult for the first season of Lower Decks, just until they got their sea legs, as you might say, or their space legs in this case. So they're done writing first season, so I'm done working for Lower Decks. They've pretty much got a pretty firm handle on where they're at now, so they don't need any more consultancy. But I'm still involved with Prodigy. The scripts for the first 2 seasons, I believe, are written. I'm still sort of providing consultation on an as-needed basis for things like design, last-minute dialogue changes. I'm seeing things like the lookbook. I'm seeing stuff like animatics, so I can see how the episode will play out. And my job is basically just to find all the little Star Trek-y details and say, well, it would be a little Star Trek-ier right here if maybe this happened. This is something you could play with if you're interested. Or if you like, you could add this touch right here, or a fun Easter egg to drop here might be this. But I got to say, right now, folks are enjoying having a good laugh and having a good run with Lower Decks. I got to say, next year, 2021, is hopefully when we're all going to get to finally see Star Trek Prodigy. I think folks are going to be blown away. It's not a kid show. It's family friendly, definitely family friendly. And it's made to be a show that parents who are already Trek fans can share with their kids to introduce them, to help bring a new generation to Star Trek. And I think that when they do, they're going to find that Prodigy embodies everything that is good about Star Trek. And I think that 50 years from now, when my generation is gone, there will be 50-year-old Star Trek fans who became fans because of Prodigy. I think that because of Prodigy, Star Trek will outlive all of us.
That's awesome. And it sounds like sort of a super fan dream job to consult on all these little details. Like if you like something enough to know all this about it, or if you've been working with something for that long, to be able to do that just sounds super cool to me.
It has been. I got to say, I wasn't physically in the room. I did everything remotely because I work from home. But to be even sort of virtually in the room with creators as talented as the Hageman brothers and the fantastic writing staff they put together, the artists, the animators, to even have been tangential to that, to have been part of that team is a great honor. And it's been a lot of fun, but it's really moving for me because, as I said, I have loved Star Trek my entire life. I grew up my whole life with it. And my professional life, I've been professionally associated with Star Trek for about 26 years. It's actually where I got my first professional writing credit, was on Star Trek Deep Space Nine. So I've been working for Star Trek for 26 years as a writer in one capacity or another. I've done everything from reference books, video games. I've done, nonfiction. I've done articles. I've contributed to scholarly research papers. TV, I've done novels, short fiction, comic books, yada, yada, yada. It's just such an honor, though, to be part of helping bring something new to life in the canon, and to have just been part of it, to know that I'm on the team. It's been very, very fulfilling and very humbling at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's super cool that you've been able to work with it for so long. And like you said, like, be part of something that's new, that's not like, it's all connected, but that's going to introduce so many new people to Star Trek, with like kids and a new generation. I think that's really cool.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be great. I think people are really going to love Prodigy. It's doing something new. It is staking out its own territory in the Star Trek universe, stylistically, narratively, visually, and I'm just really excited. I can hardly wait for people to get a look at this show. I feel like I might be more excited about it than the Hageman brothers are, but that's just because they are so cool and laid back that they're probably bursting with enthusiasm, but they never show it.
Yeah. Well, just to let everyone know what we've been talking about, of course, we've been talking about Star Trek, but also we talked about the Dark Art series, and here it is. The Midnight Front was the first book, followed by the Iron Codex, and the Shadow Commission is the newest book. All three are out now. You can binge the whole series if you want, and that's what we've been talking about today. You can also, of course, order the books from us, hopefully, if you're watching it, at chubbyandcoos.com, and place an order, or on our bookshop site, bookshop.org/shop/chubbyandcoos. If you just visit this event on our website as well, you can click on the books from there and order directly from there. So we try to make it as easy as possible for you to buy books, because that's why we're all here, right?
That's the idea.
And if you want to know more about the Dark Art series itself, there's a whole website, which is really awesome. It goes into the magic system, it goes into the characters, it goes into all the things about this series, and that's midnightfront.com if you're interested in learning more. And then David's website is davidmack.pro if you want to learn more about all the stuff David does, because David does a lot of stuff.
I got some fun stuff coming up. I've got a couple of original short stories coming up in crowdfunded anthologies. I'll be announcing more about that in the fall as the Kickstarters go live.
Awesome. And do you have anything else going on?
I'm under contract to write a new Star Trek novel that will be out next year, but nothing about it has been announced by the publisher, so I have to keep all those cards close to my vest. I'll just say it's part of something that I think is going to be big. It's going to be exciting. I think it's something that fans who have been reading the books for the last 20 years will have been looking forward to without realizing it. It's going to be a big deal, folks.
Awesome. Well, looking forward to all of that, and I hope all of you read the Dark Art series. It's super cool, especially if you like history generally and magic, which I know a lot of y'all do. This is like a good combo of those things, and of course, it's all a bloodbath because that's what David does.
Lots of action, lots of adventure, and plus, probably more than you ever wanted to know about how to smoke opium.
That's true. Well,
sometimes research is fun.
Well, thank you so much, David, for coming and talking about all of this with us. This has been awesome, and I appreciate you rescheduling because of the flood.
There's no trouble. Thank you so much for having me on. It's been a blast being here.
Awesome. And of course, everyone, again, one more time, buy books, Dark Arts, Midnight Front, Iron Codex, Shadow Commission, Star Trek, More Beautiful Than Death was that book that we talked about. So please go ahead and buy them from your indie bookstore, if not from us. But please from us if you're watching this.
If you're watching this, order it from Tubby and Coos.
Yeah.
Come on. Come on.
So thank you, David. Thanks, everyone, for watching.
Thank you, Candace.